During the heyday of Gothic, hundreds of cathedrals and thousands of churches were built across Europe. In that time, it has been estimated that more stone was quarried in France alone than in the entire history of ancient Egypt. At the heart of Gothic was a combination of all the arts, transformed by religious faith into a mystical vision. And it is at Chartres that these elements are felt to have achieved their greatest harmony. The west front of Chartres, the so-called Royal Portal, is the only group to survive the calamitous fire of 1194. The faithful were greeted by rows of Old Testament kings and queens, recalling the biblical ancestry claimed by the 12th century French kings.
These Old Testament prophets and kings and queens give us a very clear sense of the new relationship between sculpture and architecture. They stand away from their architectural background. They float serenely in space, touching neither the bottom nor the top. Their lines are dictated by those of the architecture behind them, thus their tall, slim, and vertical proportions. But they are at the same time remarkably free from their architectural constraints. At once majestic, dignified, but no longer remote. They're very human and approachable in their facial expressions and their emotions. Up above in the tympanum, we have Christ in majesty with the four evangelist symbols. With the elders of the apocalypse and angels, a majestic vision symbolizing, in fact, the promise of salvation. Unlike the teeming and crowded tympanum of Saint-Lazare at Autun, whose subject was the Last Judgment in all its terrifying detail, here we have the promise of salvation and a serenity and a majesty, and above all, an approachable humanity that animates the sculpture here. We see in them the very embodiment of the mid-12th century humanism that is so prevalent in the school of Chartres at this very time.
One of the most exciting things that happens at Chartres is that you can move from the west front to the north transept and you change completely the sense of style in the sculpture. A complete change that's taken place in the attitude towards the human body. These figures are now much freer and seem to move. They have animated facial expressions. The drapery falls around the bodies and reveals it in its contours. We've got the Old Testament kings and prophets again on both sides. All of these emphasize salvation through sacrifice. Abraham, for instance, is preparing to sacrifice his son Isaac, as God commanded him. He looks up at the angel, who orders him to substitute the ram. Both the north and south transept portals belong to the new cathedral, built after the 1194 fire. The south side follows shortly after the north, so the same changes we saw there are now even more advanced. Here, for instance, is the warrior Saint Theodore. With the weight borne on one foot, like the classical contrapposto pose, he's liberated from the architectural framework. In contrast to the other biblical figures, For the very first time, he is now dressed and armed as a contemporary 13th century crusader.
The human form and its natural depiction, now sanctioned by the Church, released the creative energies of the Gothic sculptor. Soon, a great variety of individualized figures blossomed on cathedrals, not only in France, but all over Europe. The great age of Gothic cathedrals, then, was an unparalleled time of expansiveness in European society. But in saying that, we mustn't forget that during those years, the mass of society was still dependent peasantry, unfree, laboring under an extraordinarily rigid social system. It was perhaps because their lives were so harsh that the cathedral meant so much to them. There could hardly be a greater contrast between the squalid conditions of their lives and the splendor of the cathedral to which they quite literally looked up.
Here in Chartres, we see the culmination of 50 years of architectural experimentation and development, all brought together by a master builder and to create a completely new sense of Gothic space. We start at the floor with those tall, lean pillars that rise majestically from the floor, uninterrupted, towards their capitals and their arcades, and on the front side, directly towards the vaults. The second level is that horizontal wall passage that provides a little relief from the vertical, and that prepares us for the most spectacular achievement at Chartres, those enormous clerestory windows. Windows that are as tall as the arches below, and windows that take up the full expanse of the wall. That marks it as the beginning of the classic age of French Gothic cathedrals, the period that we call the High Gothic. Chartres has more of its original glass than any other medieval cathedral. What makes possible the size of those windows and the openness of that wall is, in fact, the last major structural advance in Gothic architecture.